Walaikum
Walaikum
assalam.
salam.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikum assalam warahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Everyone. Ramadan
Yeah.
Mubarak.
Ya Ramadan.
Ramadan Mubarak.
All right, let me know when I should start and you can get it started.
Yes, inshallah.
I should start?
Yes, inshallah.
Yes, inshallah.
All right, is the sound quality okay?
Yes, okay.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Bismillah. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Barakallahu feekum, Ramadan Mubarak. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak to everyone about this very important topic of Islam and modernity. And a lot of times we hear this word modernity, but we don't really understand as Muslims exactly what's the danger of modernity. Sometimes we don't even know what the word means. What is the definition of modernity, and why is it so antithetical to Islam? And this is something that can cause a lot of problems. If you don't recognize who your enemy is, then you're not going to be able to defend yourself against that enemy, and you're going to be very vulnerable to that enemy. So this very short talk, inshallah, is going to be about modernity. How do we understand modernity, and why exactly is it so dangerous to Muslims, and why does it pose this kind of threat to Islam as a deen, as a religion? And I want to start by asking a very basic question, and hopefully you can think of the answer and maybe put it in the chat, or just think about it. So we often hear that Islam is a complete way of life. Islam is a complete way of life. And we say that Islam is not just a religion, it's a complete way of life. Touches on every aspect of life. So if we have Islam as this complete way of life, what is the majority of people in the world, what way of life are they practicing? If Islam is the alternative, or is an option as a way of life, then what is the majority of humanity actually practicing as a way of life? And you might say that, well, maybe it's Christianity. That is the largest religious affiliation, for example. But is it really Christianity? Is it a Christian way of life that's being practiced? Are Christians today practicing and living their lives as Christians were practicing 100 years ago or 500 years ago? Are they living their lives in accordance with how Isa alayhi salam lived his life, or excluding him, any of the major Christian figures, religious figures, and saints that they have and they venerate? Are they living their lives according to that system or that model? And the answer is obviously no. The answer is obviously no. Even within the past 10 years, there has been major shifts in how Christians live their lives, the kinds of values they accept, the kind of beliefs that they have. And a very small indication of that is the amount of enthusiasm that Christians in the United States, for example, had for Donald Trump as president, or as a presidential candidate. A man who is as anti-Christian or unchristian in his way of life as you can imagine. A man who goes contrary to all kinds of Christian values, yet you had so many Christians fully supporting him and very enthusiastic him on a religious basis. So that's a small indication of how we wouldn't say that the majority of people in the world are practicing a Christian way of life. And this is important. This is significant, because if we as Muslims think that Christianity, traditional Christianity of 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, is what is really targeting Muslims or is the main enemy of Muslims, that is not really accurate. We have to be accurate about what is the major threat, what is the major danger. And the answer to the question, what is the majority way of life that people practice in the world today? And you could arguably say that this is therefore the majority religion. What is the most popular religion? It's modernism. The modernist way of life, the modernist way of organizing society, the modernist way of organizing families, the modernist way of relationships between people, romantic relationships, and so forth. The economy, education, politics, governance. At every single level of human existence, the religion that is being practiced is modernist. And that's what religion ultimately, when we say that Islam is a way of life, it's not just a slogan. It means that Islam dictates how we conduct ourselves, how we as individuals, our relationship with others, how we form families, how we engage in financial transactions with others, what's called mu'amalat, generally our activities and relationships with other people, how we organize communities, how we organize society, economies, governance. All of these things are part of what it means to have a way of life. And then also our understanding, which is very crucial. How we understand the world. How do we understand the way that the world works? How do we understand where human beings have come from? Where human beings are going in the future? What is really the purpose? What is really the meaning of existence? This is all defined by one's way of life and the religion that one truly is following. But for non-Muslims, and unfortunately some Muslims, that religion, that way of life is not Islam, it is modernism. It is modernism and all of the isms and ideologies that come from modernism. So if you think about modernism at the top level, that is the overarching ideology. And then under that, you have philosophies like liberalism, you have scientism. Those are the two main branches. So if you think about, you have modernism at the top, and then two branches, liberalism and scientism. And then liberalism has certain sub-branches from that. You have secularism, you have feminism, you have capitalism, you have communism. Those all fall under liberalism. And then under scientism, you have materialism, the evolutionary theory, physicalism, empiricism, and so forth. So these are all under this broad umbrella of modernism. And this is the dominant way of life. And it is a dominant way of life such that all of these different systems of government throughout the world implement laws and implement certain values, institutionalize certain values in order to make sure that everyone is following that way of life. And when you follow that way of life, it also affects the way you think. It also affects the way that you understand yourself and you understand the world. So it's not a surprise that when Muslims are living in this dominant system that's global, they're going to secularize. Some of them will apostatize, they'll leave Islam. Their minds will become colonized. Their minds, this is what some scholars have called mental apostasy, or apostasy of the dhihn, the consciousness of the Muslim, where he calls himself and he practices rituals, but his understanding of the world and himself is dictated by these isms and these modern ideologies that are contrary to Islam. So this is very significant. And one of the central ideas, and what makes this modernism and these ideologies, which we'll inshallah talk and define more about in a minute, but I just want to give you a sense. What makes this modernism so dangerous is that it hides itself. It hides itself, which is why, if you talk about Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism, those, or even atheism, these are defined things. They have a name that people can recognize, and when you have a name that you can recognize, then you can address it very directly, and you can deal with it. You can strategize against it. You can be aware of its attacks against you and defend as needed, because it's a defined thing. But modernism is not defined in the same way. People don't think about it as this ideology, this way of life. Instead, it's just taken for granted. It's taken for granted that this is just a neutral system that accepts all ways of life, that accepts all cultures, that accepts all religions. It presents itself as a neutral playing field, and it presents itself as very tolerant in this way. So I'll give you an example from my personal life. So you think that, okay, being a modern person, being a liberal, secular person means that you're tolerant, and countries that have these modern values and secular law, they're more tolerant. And the universities, of course, the Western universities are so much more tolerant, and people from all over the world will come to a place like Harvard University, which I studied at for many years. And you have all kinds of beliefs and ideas. They're so tolerant and open-minded. They're not dogmatic like religious people. We allow everyone to come to a neutral playing field and study, for example, at the university. So I was there, but it becomes very clear very quickly that this is a very thin level. This is a very superficial tolerance that you'll find in the secular university, the bastion of freedom of thought and supposed secular neutrality. No, there's no such thing over there. They will tolerate different styles of dress. You had some Muslims at Harvard who will wear a shalwar kameez, or they'll wear a thobe, or they'll dress in different ways. And they'd have no problem with dressing in that way. Myself, I'd dress often in a thobe when I would go to pray, or I'd go on campus. There's no problem. They're very tolerant of that. Or you have the administration that will actually facilitate iftar, or they'll facilitate, there's a musalla for a salah, and that's provided by the university. So, oh, look, this is so tolerant. This is so accepting of difference. This is a characteristic feature of modernism and liberalism and so forth, all these ideologies, that they claim to tolerate differences, but it's just skin deep. It's just superficial, because you get in big trouble if you start making the claim that Islam is the truth. Islam is the exclusive truth. You start getting in trouble when you start saying things like the Islamic system of morality, what Islam requires, is more moral is in fact the peak of morality. What Islam teaches about modesty, what Islam teaches about gender relations, what Islam teaches about riba, what Islam teaches about any of these subjects, this is the peak of morality. This is the peak of rationality. This is the truth. That's not allowed. If you start claiming these things, you'll be attacked. You'll be attacked. You can only practice and you can only present yourself as a Muslim as someone who is willing to accept that there's a difference of opinion, that, well, you believe that Islam is true. I believe that worshiping idols is true and good, but there's no way to tell, right? So that's the end of it. Or you think that the having modesty and not being constantly engaged in zina, not being engaged in homosexuality, you think that that's correct. But I think those are all great things, and humans should be engaged in zina and all kinds of sexual autonomy and freedom, as they call it. And that's the best thing. So just accept that. Don't speak out against it. Don't say it's immoral. Do not say that it's irrational. Do not argue against these practices or these values. So this is, if you start talking about Islam is the truth, Islam is the peak of rationality, the peak of morality, and you're saying these things with explanation, and you're doing dawah, you're calling to Islam with wisdom, with goodly counsel, as Allah says in the Quran. You're calling to the path of Allah in this way, but you're very, confident and steadfast in the belief and the knowledge that Islam is the truth. That's not allowed. You'll be tarred and feathered. You'll be characterized as a bigot, intolerant. Okay, so then what kind of tolerance is that really? What kind of tolerance? You'll tolerate if I want to, for example, fast, because that's a personal ritual. And according to the modernist ideology, these are all different. Islam is just a culture. And there are so many cultures that people practice, but we know that cultures aren't really true. A culture is not true. What determines truth are things like science. If we want to understand what human beings are and the human nature and the future of humanity, the past, where human beings come from, we refer to scientific investigation. In terms of morality, the only moral truth is, for example, the golden rule. The golden rule. That's the only real moral truth. Everything else is just cultural and doesn't have a truth value, or the value that liberation is the center of all morality. If we want to be moral people, we have to increase liberation. We have to liberate people. This is the most important value. It can be true. This is something that's true. Democracy is the best form of government, is the most just form of government and organizing society. These are truths. Everything else, these are cultures. At best, they're cultures. At worst, they're just outdated religions that have been debunked. So this is the way that the neutral ground of modernity, the neutral ground of the secular, enlightened institutions, which are global. You can practice Islam as long as you practice it in a very limited way, and you can't even think about it. Exclusive truth. You can't even think about it as being the peak of morality, as the peak of rationality, the peak of reason, which it is. But Muslims in this way, because of being in the system, start losing confidence in Islam, many of them end up secularizing, and they have this kind of apostasy of the mind. Apostasy of the mind. So what is modernity? It is a specific theology in the 16th century of Western. It originated within Western Europe, England, France, Germany. It, since that time, has just been continuing to dominate and expand, but it's based on a very simple idea. The thinkers within 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, basically the past 400 to 500 years, they've been developing their philosophy and their ideology. And the impetus was this belief that religion is holding humanity back. Religion is actually oppressing human beings. Religion as a whole, the idea of God oppresses humanity and holds humanity back from progress. And ultimately, we don't need to refer to God. We don't need to refer to Scripture, the Quran. We don't need to refer to them in order to understand what is right and wrong. We don't need to refer to them to understand the world. No, there are other ways, correct ways, objective ways to understand these things. We use our minds, the human mind, supposedly. We use science. This is how we can answer these questions. So religion is obsolete. And in fact, religion is something that holds humanity back. The modern person and the modern society has to continuously progress. This is one of the pillars of modernism, is progressivism. Progressivism, which is the philosophy that if you have to constantly be changing and updating. And also humanity is on this continuous rise of morality and rationality. People today know more and understand more today than they did in the past. People today are more moral, ethical than they were in the past. The people of the past were barbaric. The people of the past were ignorant. And we have progressed beyond them. And human society has constantly progressed. Change is good in and of itself. If you're not changing, if you are not updating, then you are falling behind. You're falling behind, and you will fall into immorality, irrationality, and so forth. So progressivism is really the defining feature of modernity and modernism. But you can see that this is very clearly anti-religion. It's very anti-religion, especially anti-Islam. Why? Because religion, and specifically, especially Islam, they are traditional. They're traditional. What does this mean? It means that as Muslims, we take our morality, we take our understanding of the world and ourselves and so forth, our way of life is based on the past, is based on the Quran and Sunnah, but the Quran came in the past. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam lived in the past. The righteous ulama and awliya lived, the majority of them, in the past. So all of our way of life, Islam as a whole, is traditional. We're not trying to update. In fact, updating and innovating in religion is a major sin and can actually cause major problems in Iman, for Iman, if you're updating and you're trying to change and update the religion. So do you find this very extreme contrast and clash between the progressivism of modernity and the traditionalism of Islam. It's the deep conflict at the roots of these of Islam and this modern ideology. So this is why modernism is such a danger to Muslims, because Muslims, they, as I said, some of them, they will identify as being Muslim, and they'll even engage in many rituals. We have this problem, especially in the West and increasingly in the East, where Muslims will dress traditionally, Muslim women who wear hijab, but their entire understanding of morality and the world around them, their entire way of life is a modernist way of life. It's a modernist way of life. And so we have to recognize that this is the biggest danger that is threatening the iman of Muslims today. And we have to be able to recognize that it's the greatest danger and that it is this enemy in order to combat colonialism, the entire colonial project that affected the Muslim world starting in the 1800s, when Western Europe, countries like Britain, France, Denmark, they started colonizing the Muslim world. It was the basis, part of the ideology that they wanted to spread to the Muslim world was modernism. They used modernism as a weapon to attack Muslims, to attack Islam as part of the colonial project. And that's been happening for over 200 years. It's continued. It hasn't ended. Even if some of these Muslim countries, they might seem like they're independent, but really in every other way, they're dependent on masters in the West. And even if it's not overt political control, it's economic control. And if it's not overt economic control, it is intellectual control. Intellectual. So this is the colonizing of the mind. It is a very acute danger, and we have to recognize it as such. So this was a very short introduction to modernity, and its danger, and how do we define it, etc. So we can stop here and then transition to Q&A, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Daniel.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
So I have a question that I have written already in the chat, but now as I get a chance, so I'm asking the question directly to you. So for a lot of guys in the East, it is a very lucrative opportunity to, migrate in the West, like, North America and Europe. But people from the East, they are here with a better, relatively better Islamic environment, and in the West, the environment might not be that much, supportive Islamic environment. So people who want to, migrate to West for a better living or better education or for a better job or for the safe future of their children, what is your thought on that? So should they leave the East for a better lifestyle, or like if there is a better Islamic environment exists, they should stay there? And I also get some arguments against this, that if people from the East are not migrating to West, then the dawah of Islam, who will do this dawah of Islam in the West? So I would just like to know your thoughts on this. Is it clear what I've asked? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's very clear. So when I'm asked this question, I don't know a person's individual situation and what they're going through and what kind of life they have. I was born in the West. I was born in the US and lived here all my life. But it's important to have all the facts and to realize what the situation is in the West. There have been many Muslims that have migrated to the West. It depends. There are some differences between which country. Some countries provide more of an Islamic environment than others. But what we find is that a lot of the Muslims that come, they practice their religion, but their children leave Islam, or their children either they explicitly leave, apostatize, or they become culturally Muslim, like they don't actually practice Islam, or they don't really believe in Islam, but they're just culturally labeling themselves as Muslim. So it's a danger. Is this a better life to come here? Imagine, like, you are a Muslim and you are trying to come to the US, and you establish yourself. You're able to, after hard work, very hard work, start making a living and becoming stable, and you have your wife and your children, and then your wife is influenced, or if you're a sister, your husband is influenced by the environment, and they end up leaving Islam, or they end up adopting some of these modern ideologies. Your wife becomes a feminist, and she leaves you, and she takes your children, and she takes half of your wealth, or she decides that she is a strong, independent woman. She doesn't need you. You have to serve her, but she doesn't have to serve you or obey you. The things that Islam teaches, all of those values are constantly being counter-messaged in this environment, and including within the Muslim community. You think that you go to the masjid and the imam is going to give a good traditional Islamically sound information, but many, not all, many masajid are teaching the opposite of that. They're teaching the opposite of that. So there are some of these masajid are actually the source of the problem. So imagine, and then that's just your wife. Then what about your children? What kind of life is that when you are, what can be worse than that? What kind of torture in the dunya is worse than you finding out that your child doesn't believe in Islam? He's left Islam. Is there any kind of musibah? Is there any kind of disaster, calamity worse than that in the dunya? Than your child leaving Islam? You're risking. That's what you're risking coming. So it's like swimming in shark-infested waters. Are you going to take your family to go swim in shark-infested waters? There are examples and there are situations where, yeah, you can be successful. And alhamdulillah, there are many strong Muslim families and even communities in the West. There are, no doubt about it. But there's just a risk. There's a major risk to that. So you have to be aware of the risk to make a justified decision. And also Muslims in the Muslim world, it's a difficult situation, obviously, and because there is so much tyranny and oppression and theft, stealing people's resources, that it might seem that, okay, you move to the West and it's going to be better. And in certain purely dunya terms, it might be better in certain aspects, but there's also oppression here and there's also tyranny here. I mean, in the West in general, just recently, all the masajid, like I heard that in Bangladesh on Thursday, inshallah, tomorrow or today, maybe it's already Thursday for you, the masajid open up. But that's not the case in the West. In many countries, the masajid are closed shut. And in many cases, that's because of government orders. The secular government has said that, no, you can't open up until June. So after Ramadan. So where is the quote unquote religious freedom that is enjoyed when in Ramadan you can't even go pray in the masjid? So these are just some thoughts.
Assalamu alaikum.
Brother, what materials you would recommend for further studying this subject, Islam and modernity?
Okay, I would also, for studying Islam and modernity, I recommend my own website, muslimskeptic.com, which I believe the organizers have put a link to it. So I have many articles and essays, myself and other writers on this topic of Islam and modernity. I also teach at an online institute that is called Alesna Institute. Alesna Institute. So maybe the organizers can put a link to that as well, to the website. But it's online learning, and we have classes on this topic in depth on many topics related to all these different isms. So I teach for that. I also have a reading list. If you go to muslimskeptic.com, there's a reading list for further information if you want books. And inshallah, I'm publishing a book very soon about Islam and modernity, and it's being translated into Bangla. It might already be translated, so that's going to be published soon, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh.
Waalaikum salam.
Yeah, Mike, the brother previously asked about you migrating to west from east. So if not physically, we're already migrating to west intellectually, as you said before. So you divided modernism into two sects, liberalism and scientism. So when we go to universities, these mainly are the subject of arts and humanities, right? But when we go to universities, we by default, the environment is such that we default get exposed to these ideas. It doesn't matter that we study arts or humanities. So as a Muslim, we need to improve in earthly matters and as well as religious sects. So what is, how are you going to face these things? Like we are going there, but we're facing problems like these things. But in the same time, we have to maintain our religion. So in mainly the sisters in our community face most of these problems. And so does the brothers. So I'm just asking you, the main question is, how do we manage dunya and deen in universities?
So this is a big question because you have a university system that, again, is not neutral. And many of these universities in the Muslim world are based off of Western universities, and they teach Western subjects. And again, there's the idea that they are neutral, but the underlying ideas and philosophies that are being taught are contrary to Islam. So this is like a big project. How do we create Islamically valid institutions that can teach and that will take Muslims out of the modernist framework and into a truly Islamic way of life, complete way of life. Okay, so that Muslims are practicing not only spiritually, not only in terms of the ibadat, but also in terms of the way that they think and the way that they understand the world. So this is something that requires a lot of work. It's something that requires a complete paradigm shift. But people have to be willing, they have to recognize the problem in order to be willing to undertake that kind of project. And what is so critical, and what I always emphasize, is that the source of this is something where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is not something that is unprecedented. We have a source to go back to help us do this. What is that source? It is the ulama, Muslim scholars, and the traditional madaris, the madrasa, and the system that of learning that prioritizes and creates a foundation of true Islamic understanding and epistemology true Islamic values, a complete way of life, and then also incorporates other things in terms of dunyawi knowledge that might be necessary for a society, for a country, for a nation, for the ummah as a whole. So you had in the past, not even the distant past, in the recent past, and in some traditional madaris today, they teach many subjects that are, mathematics, mantiq, logic, subjects like poetry, Persian language, and many other disciplines, geometry, handasa, that are not Islamic per se, but they are within that framework incorporated into the curriculum. So that kind of conception, right now you have many Islamic schools, for example, that are completely based on a Western educational model. Is that model something that we should just replicate uncritically? They just they take the Western model and then they add like Arabic and they add like Islamic studies as electives. Like that's a minority of what is being taught and what is being learned by the students. But the entire model is based on a secular Western system. So what is our response to this? How do we challenge this? How do we critique this? How do we can do it. We have the resources to do it, but we have to be willing to look at our own tradition, our own source of values and knowledge and organization, how to organize learning, how to organize training individuals to be strong Muslims, strong ulama. We have that already, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's my point.
Assalamu alaikum, ya Sheikh. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I had actually two questions, Brother Daniel. So the first is that over here in the Indian subcontinent, what we're seeing increasingly is that liberal thought leads to people becoming more atheistic, and this is seen as a mark of intelligence, that the more liberal and atheistic your thought process is, that the more smarter you are, the more you have a reputation in the general public side. So what would be the response of us as the awam, as the normal people? How do we respond to this if we see this in people like our friends or in our family? And the second is something that you actually talk about a lot on your website, but I just want to ask you again, which is that we see a lot of the ulama, especially in the West, being affected by liberal thought and being affected by these modernist ideas. So how can we identify these issues within their speech, and how do we protect ourselves from their negative effect that they may have? Jazakallah khair for your time, and thank you.
So the first question of how do we address liberalism? Because there's this idea that the more liberal you are, the more enlightened you are, the more you understand. It's simple. You have to criticize and critique and challenge and undermine liberalism and debunk liberalism, debunk all of these ideas. And that's what a lot of my work is based on. That's what a lot of my writing and classes and lectures and books are based on, is attacking liberalism on a purely intellectual basis, in the sense that, okay, you as a liberal consider the golden rule, which is treat others as you want to be treated. You consider this to be the peak of morality, and it's what you constantly are preaching. And this is it's a liberal doctrine. So let's analyze that. Let's see if it's truly something that is respectable, something that's truly moral, something that's truly makes sense. And then you criticize it and you undermine it and you debunk it. And then when you debunk it, then the liberal person is no longer can't say that, oh, well, I'm more rational because I value freedom and equality. Backwards Muslims are following the Quran and Sunnah. you completely take away that argument. And when you do that, well, Islam has actually highest standard of behavior and morality. Islam is the most rational system. Islam is the peak of human, of what we can recognize, because it's from Allah. Allah has sent Islam, our creator. So of course it's going to be the peak of rationality and morality. And you explain this. And you, one of the first steps in doing that is to debunk these liberal claims. So, you know, we can't get into some of these kinds of debunking on this webinar, but again, like my writing, there's many examples. In my courses, there are many examples. So I'm trying to spread information about how degenerate liberalism actually is and irrational it is. That's something that we need to spread more and more, inshallah. And then people will see, and the reasonable people will see that, wow, I thought that this was a great system, this system of liberal democracy and secularism. I thought it made a lot of sense, but now I see all these problems. I see all logical holes, and now I'm able to see the problems that it creates in society and how negative and destructive it is for the human society and for the human being. So that's my overall project, is demonstrating that and showing that. As for recognizing the ulama or scholars or preachers, du'at, that are spreading liberalism, some of them don't even realize it because they don't know what liberalism is. They don't know what modernism is. And they've just adopted certain things and are teaching it without recognizing that it's contrary to Islam and that's toxic. So,
Assalamu alaikum. This is Ariful Islam. Jazakallah for your very valuable lectures on the crucial topics on modernism, and really been benefited, and you have uncovered and designated of the modernism. So my question, I have the two questions to you. That one question is on your lecture, that as you said, your lectures, we Muslims are bounded by modern economic environment, but as we see around the whole economic systems of the world, that is regulating by their modern theories, and eventually we can't but follow there's these theories, these systems of economic. So my question to you, that in this environment and circumstances, how can it make possible to Islamic marketing and companies wherein we can understanding it could make a great bankruption on the collapse in the Muslims economy? Jazakumullah khair.
So the question was, how do we create companies?
Yes. How the Islamic economics companies, that is, which we may make great bankruption on the collapse in the Muslims economy. That is what recently we are seeing, and we are looking such a collapse of the economic system. So how can we emancipate it from ourselves from these filthy economic systems, even in our country, in Bangladesh and other Muslim countries? So what's your recommendation, and what's your opinion regarding these matters? Jazakumullah.
So we're finding that Western capitalist system is very prone to collapse and creating major income inequality, major inequality of wealth between the rich and the poor. The capitalist system, by design, this is the purpose and of the liberal model, liberal capitalist model, is that it creates huge gaps between the wealthy and the poor.
Yes.
So for Muslims to want to replicate that makes no sense. And there are many different features of the world economy that Muslims have to recognize as being contrary to Islam and contrary to basic common sense that all humans should recognize. This is a system that has led to so much injustice and so much oppression, So how can Muslims want to recreate that? Rather, we have to go back to basic Islamic principles, principles of avoiding riba. Riba is something that Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam have declared war against it. So how is it that so many Muslim economies include and involve riba? This is a big problem. This is following the kuffar into the lizard hole very clearly, or just a blind pursuit of wealth, of dunya, at the cost of one's own faith. So as far as Muslims are concerned, we have to not be dependent on Western models of economics. Again, this requires intellectual work, it requires study, it requires academic investigation that Muslims should do, and some Muslims have done. And what is an Islamic economy, and how can it be brought about? I haven't done in-depth research question, but it's something that needs to be investigated. And then Muslims also need to be willing to cooperate and collaborate with other believers, with other Muslims. This is another strategy of the colonizers, to divide and conquer, divide Muslims up into separate nations so that they'll be isolated from the other believers. They don't want Muslims in Pakistan working with Muslims in Bangladesh, working with Muslims in Turkey, working with Muslims in Morocco. They don't want all of the Muslims throughout the world to work together and to collaborate and to trade with each other, to prefer each other. Are you going to, it's very sad, like sometimes you will find some Muslims will say that, well, this is more profitable to work with non-Muslims. It's more profitable for me to work with Western companies. It's more profitable for me. And instead of preferring another Muslim or a Muslim business, this creates weakness for Muslim economies. So we have to change that.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Daniel. I am
Waalaikum salam.
Mubin. My question is that one of the rising problem of current world is scientism. And science is being used against religion. And this is being promoted by many popular public figures. For example, some days ago, I saw you refuting an article of Parvez Footboy, a physicist. And this problem of scientism is also prevalent in our country. So as a Muslim, how to deal this problem of scientism, and what is your suggestion regarding studying philosophy, especially philosophy of science, as you are a philosopher of science, as I know. Thank you.
I think that my strategy has been to point to the contradictions within science. So with that article from Parvez Footboy, I took his claims. He's not even a biologist. He is trained in physics. So I don't know why he was trying to talk about Darwin. But yeah, so then it's very easy to show that many of what is considered to be scientific consensus, much of what is considered scientific consensus, is contradictory, is self-contradictory. And you have to be willing to do that analysis. And I've done that kind of analysis before. So there was this claim that was very popular that human beings and chimpanzees share 99% of their DNA. And this was an argument that evolutionists made, that this shows that human evolution from chimpanzees, or I mean from apes, from pre-hominid apes, is true. One of the main evidences is the similarity, 99% similarity between chimpanzee DNA and human DNA. And this claim was spread and was used in debates and used in arguments to argue against Islam. So I did 3 months of investigation where I read probably 200 papers on this issue. And I had to learn a lot about genetics and genomics and how they determine how two DNA strands or the chromosomes of human beings versus chimpanzees, how they're compared to get this 99% similarity. And what I found out, and I wrote an entire article or essay on it, is that this was a bogus claim. It was a completely false claim, and that there is no such major similarity. There's only certain similarity in a very qualified sense with those parts of the chimp genome that is analogous to the human genome. And if you want to do an actual comparison and get a percentage between base pairs of the DNA, you wouldn't even get to 2% or 3% similarity because they're so dissimilar. So I did an entire analysis of this by actually going back and reading the papers. And you find buried within many of these scientific papers, they admit it. They admit it themselves, but it's buried because it can't be said publicly, or it has to be something that is minimized because it contradicts an overall scientific narrative, this scientific ideology. So you find these things if you do the actual scientific reading and analysis. It's possible. As for studying philosophy, I don't recommend Muslims study philosophy in the university. It can lead to a lot of doubts, and it can lead to confusion. So it's best if Muslims don't go into the university system to study philosophy specifically. As for the history of science, that's very good. Muslims should be aware of the history of science because it shows how convoluted it is and how often what was considered the scientific truth and scientific consensus is then completely overridden and made obsolete by other scientific work. So this is what one philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, called scientific revolutions. There are revolutions within science that completely displace previous theories, and new theories are created. So if new theories are constantly being coming into dominance and predominance and becoming the scientific consensus, what's to say that tomorrow or a year or 5 years or 50 years, that theory that is in vogue today is not going to be obsolete, is not going to be discovered, oh, actually, this is completely false. This is actually completely inaccurate. So that kind of history of science is useful because it puts science in its place. It puts science, it takes science off of its pedestal, basically, as this kind of objective, absolute epistemology, absolute way to know what the world is about. And if you do that, then you can recognize that, well, this is man-made. Science is something man-made. It's based on the limitations of human reason, the limitations of human sight and sound and hearing and our senses, which are very limited. So of course, how could we expect that such a limited, deficient system would lead us to true understanding of the nature of reality, the nature of human beings? Of course it wouldn't. We wouldn't have that expectation. So that, I think that's useful.
Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Brother, please, can you give me some time? Ustadh Daniel, we have some questions in chat. Will you consider to respond to them right now or later?
Yeah, just read them to me, whichever ones, because I can't. There's like too many in the chat that I can't really.
I was actually. I think someone else have to because I cannot see the message. Okay.
Okay, let me see.
I think you can take another question and then we will read them. Okay.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Assalamu alaikum. So my question, being a majority Muslim country, we have not yet developed any Islamic psychology or psychological therapy course or any other degrees. So for this reason, our universities has organized and taken the whole Western concept of the Islamic therapy and mental health issues. They are not even doing the research on the basis of our cultural aspect. They're taking all the data from the Western and they're teaching. Like most of the problem is the Buddhist meditation and the hypnotism and all the things that are against Muslim psychology, they are using it. So how can we defend in that way? And the one of the most problem is in our IB or BBS sessions, the people are teaching psychology in the name of psychology. They are teaching the Western psychology, and they are even changing their religion by the psychology course. They like to address themselves as a spiritual, not religious. That's the new trend of our country. So how can we defend them without any academic degree or academic knowledge? Because in our country is developing, and for this reason mental health is becoming a current issue. So people are in depression and they are going to the mental health expert. Those are mostly secular people. So how can we defend them in that aspect? Thank you.
Wait, defend who?
Yes.
I didn't understand. Like you asked, like who defend who? Who are we defending?
How can we defend the academic secular mental health specialists that this is not the right way to diagnose our Muslim fellow brothers?
Yeah, so I agree with you completely. Like this is just like with all of these other issues, you have the Muslims who are taking a completely Western ideology, a Western discipline, and they're just accepting it wholesale, as if that accepting it is not going to have any contradiction with Islam. There are deep contradictions between Islam and any of these modernist systems and modernist epistemologies, including psychology. One of the things that is taught in psychology is the idea that you should, for example, never discipline a student. You should never discipline a child because that's negative reinforcement. You should never be negative. For example, if you're a parent, never tell your child no. Never tell your child that that's wrong or punish your child. Never do that, because that's negative reinforcement, and that's going to negatively influence their psychology. But this is contrary to Islam. In Islam, we have the notion of tarbiyah. Tarbiyah is so important that the student or the child, if you don't discipline him or her, they're not going to be able to imbibe these important values, these important Islamic values. They're not going to be able to discipline the nafs, the soul. They're not going to be able to take these important qualities spiritually and socially. Discipline is extremely, extremely important, but you have many psychologists, and this has become an entire movement. It's called positive psychology, that only positive reinforcement, no negative reinforcement, never say something negative to a child or to a student. But this is going to lead to disaster. And I've seen many families, unfortunately, and we see it in the West because it's very common. This is why we have so many problems with drugs in the West. We have so many with lack of discipline, lack of motivation. These students are going to the university, they can't concentrate, they have terrible character, they have terrible behaviors. They're just extremely egotistical, extremely pampered, entitled, the entitlement syndrome that these children have. They're adults now, but they were raised by parents who bought into positive psychology in the West. It's led to a lot of social problems because of this psychology that is still being taught and is still being adopted. And then Muslims come and just adopt it and take its data and take all of these books and texts from that discipline, and they just like add a hadith and say, oh, now we have Islamic psychology. Or that's really how superficial some of these Islamic psychologists really are. But It's a big problem, and it's not just psychology. All of these different disciplines are fundamentally based on a secular modernist paradigm, and you can't adopt the discipline without all the baggage, and it's the baggage that's going to poison, the baggage that's going to suffocate you. So we have to be aware of that.
Assalamu alaikum, Ustadh.
Wa alaikum salam.
So many of the Orientalists and atheists claim that the Muslim scientists of the past, whose names are frequently mentioned of, like Abu Bakr al-Razi and Ibn Sina, were either apostates or non-practicing Muslims, and thus they try to prove that intellect denies Islam. And what would be our answers to that? Also, do you support the strategy of bringing up their works in public for dawah purposes?
Well, I didn't hear the second question.
Do you support the strategy of bringing up their works in public for dawah purposes?
Bring up their works
in public for dawah purposes, to do dawah?
No, this is inferiority. This is inferiority. Like, first of all, in what sense are they Muslim scientists? Like Ibn Sina, how is he a Muslim scientist? The word scientist wasn't coined until the 18th century. So how are you talking about Ibn Sina or these Muslim scientists? Ibn Sina himself, like his work is based on Aristotle. It's not like, is Aristotle a scientist? So why are Muslims claiming him as this kind of rational thinker? Yeah, he was a rationalist. He was also a deviant. And Imam Ghazali even made takfir of Ibn Sina because of his deviant views, extremely deviant views. He denied the akhirah as being something that is physical. For example, he thought that it was not a non-physical. He denied resurrection as a physical resurrection, and many other extremely heretical beliefs. So how can any Muslim claim Ibn Sina in good conscience? And then this whole idea of, oh, we have Muslim scientists, it's inferiority. Like, why can't we have Islam. We have Islam as entire way of life. Why do we have to point to what they have and say, oh, we have a version of that too, please accept us? That's not going to do da'wah. That's not going to convince anyone. Even if the non-Muslim believes what we say, like, oh, we have Muslim scientists too that were great and amazing. The non-Muslims say, oh, okay, that's nice. That's nice. How many Nobel Prizes have Muslims won? That's what they'll say. So it doesn't really, it's not da'wah, it's just inferiority complex. It's inferiority complex. We have to offer something that's truly unique that they don't have. And guess what? They don't have a lot because they don't have Islam. So why don't we focus on those unique aspects of Islam that are clearly superior, unless we ourselves don't believe that? And that's what I mean, the colonization of the mind. And that's why my institute is named Al-Asna Institute. It's coming from the statement of Umar radiallahu anhu, who when he became Muslim, he had a statement when he became Muslim. He wanted the Muslims to go and pray publicly and do salah in the haram in Mecca. And his statement was, Alasna ala al-haq, are we not on the truth? And he had that kind of confidence and that kind of belief that we have to show ourselves and we shouldn't be afraid because we have the truth. So if we have the truth, we're not going to be feeling inferior. We're not going to, oh, we have Muslim psychologists, we have Muslim scientists, we have Muslim whatever. This is not a winning strategy. If the goal is da'wah, this is not a winning strategy.
Brother, assalamu alaikum, brothers. Please keep your mic muted. We are now going for the questions asked in the chat. Please ask them later. Najib bhai, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Okay, Najib bhai will do it.
From our sisters, what's more important now in this situation of modernity in the environment of universities? To save our iman first, or to spend time studying debunking or attacking logically to them? And also, how can we give dawah in such a heap of modernist mentalities of people where they are majority and we are so little in number?
So being little in number that's the situation of Muslims from the beginning. Muslims from the beginning were little in number. We were the minority, and then we took on the world. That's not a problem. We have to expect it, actually. We have to expect that we're going to be the minority, but that doesn't discourage us from facing the majority because we have the truth. And when you have the truth, it doesn't matter if you're just one person. And there are many examples of Anbiya, prophets, that were just by themselves. They're the only ones who believed. And they were faced with entire societies that did not believe, but they pressed forward and they called to the truth, and they were strengthened by Allah for that. So we have to have the same kind of confidence and belief. As long as you have the truth, then what else do you need? What else do you need? That's the main thing. As for if you're in the university, should you be concerned more about your iman versus fighting these ideologies? Well, these two things are not distinct. Sometimes you have Muslims who are facing these shubuhat. They have these kinds of doubts. So saving your own iman involves critiquing and debunking these ideologies. So those things are actually intimately related. But if you don't have any doubts and you don't have any shubuhat, alhamdulillah, that's excellent. And I'm sure most of you are like that. So yeah, of course, preserve yourself. That is a priority as opposed to doing dawah. If you're going to be in an environment, like I don't recommend you just go and start debating atheists or you go and start and debating these people, if that's going to cause you to doubt Islam or that's going to confuse you. Don't put yourself in that danger. You don't have the individual responsibility to do that. So I don't recommend that. You should prioritize your own state and your own iman first and foremost.
Another question from our brother. Assalamu alaikum. As you mentioned, we must debunk modernism. Sometimes I have faced questions like we Muslims are sadistic and punish too much, as our concept is whoever doesn't follow Islam burns in hell. How do we answer such questions? And internet, in my opinion, is the major source of modernism. How do we protect ourselves and our family from such problems?
So modernism is something that is constantly critiquing Islam. And it has all of these different arguments about punishment. Oh, Islam is barbaric, Islam has hudud, Islam has hellfire, and all of these kinds of things. But I mean, these are like secondary concerns, or these are secondary issues. You can't really address those issues until you start addressing some of the bias that from which these questions come. Because one of the main ideologies that we didn't really talk about, utilitarianism. And this is the idea that the most important thing is bodily pleasure. The most important thing is bodily pleasure. Whatever maximizes bodily pleasure is good, and whatever minimizes it or decreases it is morally bad. And this is an ideology that is constantly promoted, not necessarily by name, but this is assumed by many people in the modern world. This is part of that way of life that we're talking about, and that religion, modern religion. And the reality is that utilitarianism is completely contrary to human nature. And when it comes to human nature, we often sacrifice, and we have the instinct to sacrifice our own immediate pleasures for the benefit of others. For the benefit of others. For example, a father is going to sacrifice, he has the instinct to sacrifice his bodily health for his family. A mother will sacrifice her health for her children. That's what in many cases is what's best. So it's contrary to utilitarianism. Or the idea that we sacrifice for the sake of Allah. when we fight for the sake of Allah, when we fight for the sake of Islam, that's something that is contrary to our individual bodily health. But it is something that Muslims want to do and Muslims strive to do. And it's one of the greatest deeds that a Muslim can undertake. But it's contrary to bodily pleasure. It's contrary to bodily pleasure. And even beyond Muslims, this idea of sacrificing for the greater good, sacrificing your body for the greater good, all of these things contradict utilitarianism. But the utilitarian mindset that bodily health or bodily pleasure is the best thing and is the basis of all morality, whereas pain, any kind of pain, is the worst thing, is the worst evil, and there's no evil worse than that. This is a fundamental bias that has to be debunked. Otherwise, these questions are not going to be, you can't satisfactorily answer them, or it's difficult to answer them. So we can't get into the full debunking and theory of utilitarianism in this Q&A, but that's the kind of approach that we should take for these kinds of questions.
Brother Daniel, how long do you want to continue this session? I think it's already tiring and it's a long time.
I
it's
can
up
continue.
to you.
No, I can continue.
If you are
I'm
tired,
fine.
you can limit it. Okay.
Let's keep
okay.
going.
Najib bhai.
Yes. Another question from our sister. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I wanted to ask a question. As Mr. Daniel said that these days people are introducing Western curriculum and adding Quranic studies or hifz to modernize it. My question is, how can we keep our pace with the modern world by avoiding the modern curriculum or by rejecting it? If we want our children to gain Islamic knowledge and side by side, we want them to be well educated and established, we need to introduce them to the modern studies to some extent. So how to draw a line between what to let them learn and what to avoid in the present world?
So education has two components. Modern education has two components. And there's a whole history, intellectual history, why the modern education system is the way it is, that we can't get into now for the sake of time. But the two components of education is that there's a vocational element, and then there's a cultural element. So the Enlightenment thinkers in Britain and France and Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries, when they were thinking about public education and the modern university system, they thought that, well, an educated person, an enlightened person, citizen in a country has to know the skills to be able to do work. That's vocational, has to do working and making money and contributing to society, etc. But there's also a cultural component. He has to be cultured by learning the arts, by learning literature, by learning poetry, by learning music. This is what an educated person is. By studying Greek philosophy, Greek thought, and all of these kinds of what's now considered liberal arts education. So these two components, Islamically, when it comes to vocational knowledge, then yes, your children need to learn how to navigate on an individual level and be able to provide for themselves, to be able to work. That's the vocational component. But you have to be careful about the second component, the cultural component. The problem with a lot of these Western universities is that they bundle them together, or Western style universities, they bundle the cultural and the vocational. So as a short-term solution, try to make sure that your child is focusing on Islamic studies. This is, like, I'll give you a personal example with my children. My children are still young, but they're getting older and they're homeschooled. So we don't send them to public school because of all these problems. And in their homeschool, they focus on Islam and studies, learning and memorizing Quran, learning Sirah, memorizing Hadith, trying to understand Islam and the world through Islam as Muslims. So that's the main focus of their education, but we recognize that, well, they need a vocational aspect too. So they're also learning English. They're learning they're learning math, right? They're learning geometry. They're learning these kinds of subjects. Eventually, I'll probably want to teach them higher levels of math. They're learning a lot of science as well. But that's a small part. Those are the electives, basically. Those are the electives. The main meat of their education is with Islamic studies. So this is the kind of model that we're implementing for our family, and we're trying to develop like a sustainable model that we can share with other Muslims and have actual curricula, Islamic school curricula that other Muslims can use for their children or at Islamic schools, that takes this philosophy and this kind of methodology and operation. So that's our goal, inshallah, through my institute.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. There is another question from a sister. The question is, in case of giving dawah to a mentally apostate person, how can we make them understand the truth when their complete reference frame is different from us? For example, when we say homosexuality is not permitted, they play the empathy card. Also, if the rivalry mode between Islamist and modernist keeps going on, would that make the modernists more stubborn in their opinion?
No, why should I make it? Yeah, people are stubborn. How does that what does that have to do with the requirement to speak the truth and to call to Islam? So you have, again, Anbiya who were preaching to their people for hundreds of years, constantly giving da'wah, and no one became Muslim, or very few, but they still had that requirement. They had that job. So we have to keep that in mind. And if someone who is mentally colonized, the way to get them out of that, like I said, just show contradictions, show how some of these ideologies are fundamentally flawed. And it's easier said than done, but growing up, I had my parents are from Iran, and Iran wasn't colonized in the same way that the subcontinent was colonized, but it was definitely intellectually colonized. And my family, my extended family, has that issue, has that problem. And growing up, I had a lot of arguments and debates, but it's just a constant process. And I found that the most effective thing, because some people, debate is not going to help them, and they're going to be more convinced by you're a family member and you're just good to them and you're nice, and then there's opportunities for them to be more open to what you have to say and more willing to accept what you have to say. So there are people like that. And there are people who are more intellectual, or they want to debate, or they want to argue because they're constantly arguing against Islam and they're constantly trying to bash Islam. So those people are threatening Muslims, they're threatening Islam. You have to be able to respond to that. And for me, I had that in my family, so I had to learn how to respond. And I found that in those kinds of contexts and those kinds of conversations, the best thing for that was to point out the contradictions in the ideologies that they profess. So liberalism, secularism, feminism, all of these things you will argue against. And one of the ways to argue against them is to show contradictions. I guess one example that I can give you is on the golden rule. I mentioned the golden rule before. Treat others as you want to be treated. It seems like it's a very good principle, but when you think about it more closely, why should you treat others the way that you want to be treated? Isn't that self-centered? Isn't that egotistical? Why should my feelings and what I like and what I prefer be the basis for treatment of everyone else in the world. How is that logical? And there are many examples where I prefer something, but someone else doesn't prefer that. So why should I treat them the way that I want to be treated, when that will actually harm them, or that's something that they hate, or that's something that's not good for them, right? Or for example, you are a masochist. You enjoy being hurt for whatever psychological reason. So should you hurt others because that's what you prefer? That's what you enjoy? So at a very basic level of scrutiny, this golden rule completely collapses, and you discover that it's meaningless. It's a meaningless slogan. And that's all you need to show. That's all you need to show for that particular issue. And whenever I explain this to Muslims, they mention the hadith that none of you truly believes until none of you truly believes until he wants for himself what he wants for his what he wants for his brother is what he wants for himself. This is a famous hadith. But that hadith doesn't mean that you want for your brother something that is contrary to Islam. You don't want for your brother something that is contrary to what Islam says is right and wrong, what Islam says is good or bad. Correct? So we have to understand that hadith in the proper light. And it's completely against and contrary to this golden rule. And there's another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, none of you truly believes until his internal state, his internal inclinations are in accordance with what I have brought, meaning what the Prophet ﷺ has brought, meaning Islam. So this is our standard of right and wrong, is what Islam says is right and wrong, what Allah has revealed as being right and wrong, not what we individually feel. This is how I want to be treated, therefore I'll treat others in this way, which is what the golden rule is about. So you can completely debunk the idea of the golden rule in just a few sentences.
So this is the last question from the chat. So this is from again from my sister. So the question is, do you think there is lack of orthodox figures in academic world? Many educated Muslims don't really appreciate traditional ulamas, so they tend to seek knowledge from academic figures who preaches many modernist views. It's very hard to convince them against those views. What do you think we should do to prevent this?
I think that there are teachers and scholars who do speak a great deal against modernism. And when you look at history, many of the biggest resistors of colonialism, especially in the subcontinent, were ulama, and the madaris, the traditional madrasa, was standing strong against the British reform and the British reformed educational institutions. It was the madrasa that provided the alternative. It was the madrasa and the ulama that were criticizing colonization and secularism and so forth. That is our history. That is our tradition. And there are some who are still upholding that tradition. Unfortunately, there are some who are not and who themselves are colonized, but the majority are coming from that tradition of fighting colonialism. So we have to encourage that, and we have to support. If you find someone, a scholar who is speaking the truth and is fighting against these ideologies, then you need to support that person. You need to support that person. And if you see someone who is saying pro-liberal, pro-feminist, pro-modernist teaching, you find someone like that, don't support him. Don't support him. Don't share his material. Don't follow him. Just avoid such a person. That if Muslims overall did this, then you'd find that, oh, okay, because just because you don't know about these scholars That doesn't mean that they don't exist. Unfortunately, the people who are popular, and it's not because of just, it's because they've been propped up. Many of these modernist preachers, Muslim preachers, they've been propped up by the governments, and they are getting a lot of government support and government funding, and the secular system is positioning them and advertising them. That's why you might know about them, but you don't know about all of the more traditional ulama who are contrary to modernism, who are attacking modernism, and they're coming from a tradition of attacking modernism and the colonizer and so forth. So we have to be aware of this dynamic.
So this is the last mic question. Anyone?
Yes.
Hello.
Salam.
Is there anyone who wants to ask a question directly? If there is,
Yes.
please. Yes.
Hello, Assalamualaikum. Yes, my question is, as surrounded by so-called Islamic preachers who mix Islam with modernism, it's very difficult to get the true message of Islam. My question is, how did you study about them? What are the things helped you in your research? And I have also another question. Also, please tell us about RAND Corporation, their agenda, and how they are plotting against Muslims. Thank you.
So my background, I studied traditionally with scholars, and it was through those teachers and also good friends that, alhamdulillah, I was able to distinguish Islam from modernism and modernist Islam. And then I also deepened my studies by studying this ideology and this other way of life. And it's after many years. Now it's getting close to 20 years, 15 years that I've been studying it. So that's my journey. As for your second question was
RAND Corporation.
RAND Corporation, yeah. So RAND is a think tank, and they produced a couple of research papers on counter-extremism and counter-terrorism and how the West can ensure that the Muslim world falls into line and obeys their Western masters. And RAND is just one think tank. There are many think tanks, and the entire colonial project for the past 220 years is based on the same process or the same fundamental principles. And there are certain things that the colonizers recognized. How the colonizers want to control Muslims. So how do we control Muslims? We have to undermine Islam. How do we undermine Islam? Well, we have to co-opt certain scholars. We have to co-opt certain kinds of institutions, meaning we control them, and we make sure that they preach an Islam that is favorable to us as the colonizer, that's favorable to us and our interests, Western interests. So they would do this. They would co-opt certain figures, certain scholars, making sure that they paid them. And they would attack whoever opposed colonialism, who opposed Westernization, attack them as being terrorists, attack them as being barbaric, attack them as being backwards, attack all of those institutions that are resisting the colonizer by, first of all, dissolving and destroying all the awqaf, the financial basis of those madaris and those masajid and those scholars, take away their money if they oppose us, if they oppose the colonizer. So all of these kinds of strategies, divide and conquer, as we mentioned before, make Islam something that is very specific to a culture. So you have Bengali Muslims, you have Indian Muslims, Hyderabadi Muslims, you have Malaysian Muslims, you have Egyptian Muslims, Arab, non-Arab, create as much division as possible. Have divisions between the madhahib, different schools of thought, Sunni schools of thought. Say, oh, you follow this opinion, well, this is the right opinion. we need to create more and more division, as much division as possible. And this is how we will destroy and control. We'll destroy Islam and we'll control Muslims, and we'll take Islam out of the Muslim mind. So the Rand, that think tank, just had like a couple of papers on this strategy, and it's very useful to read that because you see how their strategy is being implemented in front of us. One of the things that the Rand report says in one of the reports, I forgot exactly the title of it, but it's like creating moderate Muslim networks. That's one of their papers. They have two major papers. And in that, they talk about the importance of social justice, promoting the idea of social justice in the Muslim community, because we want Muslims to be focused on issues of social justice, like equal rights for everyone and equality between men, women, homosexuals, different races, different ethnicities. This has to be their primary focus. If we get Muslims to focus on this, then they won't be focused on dawah. They won't be focused on spreading Islam. They won't be focused on building up their community as a Muslim community that is strong and on the haqq, on its own principles. Rather, they're distracted with these external issues of constantly being active in social justice causes. So this is exactly what we see today and in the past 5 to 10 years. And Rand is proposing this as a way to weaken Muslims and weaken Islam. So we can have a whole series of lectures just on Rand and just on this project, but that'll give you a sense of it.
So we are going to finish our session, I think. And thanks a lot, Brother Daniel Haqiqatzou, for joining us and managing your time from your busy schedule. We would like to have you again. Jazakallahu khairan.
Wa iyyakum. Barakallahu feekum. Thank you so much. I was very happy to speak with you. I hope you have a very good Ramadan.
And we apologize to our brothers and sisters who have many questions, but